Welcome class to chapter 6 on communities and ecosystems. These are the learning objectives that we'll look at. You'll also have a quiz on this chapter soon coming up, so keep it in mind for that due date for that quiz. So we'll really look about this chapter is on communities, ecosystems, and we'll start with here. So the straight poop on dung beetles. We're going to learn how even dung beetles have an important part in the food ecosystem, the food web. This is a great video to watch on what a dung beetle does. Basically, these beetles will consume the dung and dig holes for it and get rid of it. And they're especially important on places like the African prairie, where there's a lot of animals and a lot of waste, and these dung beetles help get rid of that waste. So there's interconnections, and there's numerous throughout the systems. Their connections are complex, and the different components of ecosystems are dependent on others, such as grasses, herbivores, dung beetles, and insectivores. So what dung beetles will do is they'll take waste or poop from animals and roll it into balls and bury it to get rid of it. And they'll also feed on it. So it's just really the world's way of getting rid of waste, especially in the African desert. Dung beetles were so important that there are different hieroglyphics of them in ancient Egypt history. There's two types of interactions when we talk about competition for shared resources. There can be intraspecific competition where members of the same species compete, a zebra versus a zebra for some sort of food source. And in contrast to that, we have interspecific competition where different species compete, such as the wildebeest versus zebras. The competitive exclusion principles talks about how two species that directly compete for resources cannot coexist. And an example of this is this bacterium. So this just talks about how if you have two different types of species, if they're competing for the same resources, they cannot coexist. And this just shows, in general, the population density of these two types of bacterium over the course of days. And just showing how when they're grown together, one of the bacterium will exist longer and in greater population density than the other, versus if they're grown separately, then they can both exist because they're not competing for the same resources. So in an ecosystem, different species, different plants, animals can coexist because they will compete for different resources. The ecological niche is the role an organism fills within its habitat, and you should know these definitions. I think I use these on a quiz or a test question coming up. A fundamental niche is the complete range of areas in which an organism could exist, and a realized niche is the range in which an organism actually exists due to competition. So the ecological niche differentiation is the division of resources. Potential competitors may coexist, such as warblers. Those are birds that live in evergreen trees, and prairie plant root structure. And I'll show how they can coexist. So this is a quiz question that will be on your next quiz. And this just shows how different types of warbler birds will occupy different parts of the tree for to live, to survive, and to get their food source. So they can coexist, but just in different parts of the tree. And this is a look at rooted plants, how they can also coexist, but their roots will run deeper or more shallower than their fellow plants. So they will all gather resources from different parts of the soil, but they can coexist. Mechanisms of competition, we say there is exploitation competition, which will consume the resource much faster, or interference competition will stop the competitor from consuming the resource, usually by killing them off. So this just shows that these desert plants are spaced evenly apart. And if you go out into the desert or drive by Eastern California, you can see that all the desert cacti are usually spaced evenly. And that's because they use the water resources surrounding them, and other desert cacti can't be within the same vicinity or too close because they'll compete for the same water. This is an example of what these guys are doing is they're competing for the same food. That must have been a killed animal there, and these hyenas will most likely kill off or scare away the turkeys so that they can get that resource themselves for food. Herbivores are adapted to feed on plant material. Coevolution is a tit-for-tat evolution of a prey in a species that consumes it. For example, a milkweed and monarch butterfly will work together to kind of feed off of each other so that they can both survive in ways. So this is a look at the monarch butterfly and the milkweed plant. The caterpillar will feed off its leaves and then eventually become a butterfly that can go on and pollinate that milkweed plant. Predators will capture, kill, and consume prey. They might switch their prey, but the prey will respond by adapting different defenses. So this is a look at a large whale and seagulls surrounding it in the ocean. This is a look at an insect, a stick insect that is camouflaged to look like a stick to try to blend into its surroundings. This is a look at the Canada lynx and the snowshoe hare, different number of animals trapped throughout the past several hundred years, and just showing how if we have more snowshoe hares, we usually will have less lynxes fighting them off. But as the population of lynx increases, they will kill off the snowshoe hares, so that's why we have less of those trapped. Parasites depend on living host for nourishment. They usually do not kill the host. They can be internal or external, and they will be spread by vectors, which will carry the parasite but will be relatively unaffected. The spread of the parasite disease is governed by these 4 factors, which I'll let you read through. And again, please pause the lecture video at any time to do so. So this is a look at the rat as the common vector in the bubonic plague that occurred many years ago, and the rats were the vector for that. They were unaffected by the disease, but they were carrying it. These are beetles, which are unaffected by a disease, but carry it to all these trees. This was especially true in California. These beetles were carrying a disease that would kill off certain trees. And you can see here the trees that are killed off are the ones with the darker leaves. Symbioses is an intimate relationship between 2 species, and mutualism is when both species benefit, like the fig and the wasp. The wasp will feed off the fig, so the fig will provide its nutrients, and the wasp will also potentially pollinate or spread its seeds. This is another look at the ant, and this is a horned plant. Well, it will help keep the ant safe, but the ant can also feed off of it. Symbioses, commensalism, one species will benefit, the other will be unaffected, such as snails and hermit crabs. The hermit crab will make their home in a bed of snail shells. Energy must flow through ecological communities, and this energy flow is the transfer and transformation of energy. Organisms will be classified by their trophic level, which is based on the food source, and this explains different trophic levels, and I'll let you guys watch this food chain video. So these are the trophic levels of the food chain web. Decomposers are organisms that feed on non-living organic matter, and primary producers will use energy from the sun and also things from decomposers to create plants that herbivores will feed off of. So second trophic level are primary consumers off of these plants. Third trophic level are secondary consumers, and the fourth trophic level are tertiary consumers that will feed off of the level below them. You should have a good understanding of what this food kind of pyramid shows, because there will be questions like this on your exam and your quiz. So food chains and food webs depict the feeding relationships among organisms. Primary producers are on the first trophic level. They will transport energy from the sun or chemicals, and then primary consumers on the second trophic level will eat those primary producers, which are usually plants. So the primary consumers will most likely always be herbivores. The secondary consumers will eat the insects, the bugs, the animals right below them. They will most likely be carnivores. And the tertiary consumers in the fourth trophic level are the top carnivores. And then decomposers will feed on non-living organic matter. Biomass energy is food that can be consumed by higher trophic levels. And we say the trophic level efficiency decreases by 10%, so only about 10% is available to the next trophic level. That's because much of the energy is consumed is used by that organism itself. So what this means is that if this bunny eats a carrot as well as oxygen, some of that food energy will be lost in the respiration in respiration and heat. Other food energy will be lost as weight. So food energy stored as biomass will only be about 10% that goes on to the next trophic level. And this just shows you, if we look at kilocalories, they will decrease by about 10% as we move up the food pyramid ladder. And that's just because some of the energy will be lost as heat, as waste, and that explains that. Food webs depict all of the feeding relationships. They're more detailed than food chains, and more complex food webs will provide greater stability, as seen here. So this is a complex food web, not just a single food chain, but just showing how there's many different types of structures, insects that make up the primary consumer level and the secondary consumer and tertiary consumer level. So if you take out just one, the whole food web might not be affected. If we take out all of the tertiary consumers, then we will have a problem. But you can see here that more than one insect organism will make up each level of the food web. The arrows are just showing, the thicker arrows will indicate a greater amount of energy transferred among the food web members. You can see how the arrows will decrease in size as we move up the levels. This is another look. You can kind of see the red-tailed hawk and the fox at the top of the food web here. And you can see the different organisms that occupy lower trophic levels. Keystone species are named after wedge-shaped keystone that holds arch structures together. And if we remove them, there could be collapse. Keystone species are important to the stability of many food webs. Most often they're plants, but sometimes they're predators. And a trophic cascade occurs when the loss of carnivores will result in the explosion of herbivores that destroy primary producers. So what this means, if we lose our top carnivore, that means the carnivore isn't there eating all these herbivores. So we have an explosion of herbivore organisms, and they will eat too many of the primary producers. So we'll kill off our primary producer level. And that's what we call a trophic cascade. That's what happened in this picture. You can see there aren't many trees, the aspen trees left. Also, an example of this is shown by the antelope and the fox in Canada, and you can read through this example when you download the PowerPoint as well. If we look at the salamander's role in the California forests, the salamander is usually the top carnivore, or not the top carnivore, but they'll be at the top of their food web. And there was a kind of a little experiment done where they put salamanders in certain plots, and they just looked at what happened when they took the salamanders out, and they saw an explosion of the leaf-consuming invertebrates, which would get rid of the bacteria and fungi and leaf litter more, all because there wasn't a top carnivore, the salamander there. Then we look at the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle looks at how terrestrial carbon goes through the cycle in the earth. And this is a great YouTube video that looks at the carbon cycle. The flux of carbon is driven by life through respiration and photosynthesis, because respiration, breathing out, returns carbon to the atmosphere, and photosynthesis takes carbon out of the atmosphere. And this just looks at how carbon is inputted into the atmosphere and released, and how it is stored. Most carbon is stored in biomass, so most is in plant litter, waste, dead organisms. The carbon pool can also be in climate and water. So this is carbon in the atmosphere, looking how fossil fuels greatly increase carbon in the atmosphere, and just a look at how producers, consumers, and decomposers change the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. This is a look at the net primary production. um, of the net primary production. Let me just take this up here, of the tropical rainforest, which would help to decrease the amounts of carbon. So when we talk about things like deforestation, deforestation is a huge problem because trees will take carbon out of the atmosphere. And when we are taking down our trees, we're getting rid of that ability to take out carbon. Aquatic and marine carbon. So carbon can also be in pools and oceans, lakes, and rivers. Carbon is used to make shells of marine organisms, and much of this carbon will fall as sediment to the ocean floor, while ocean will absorb carbon. And that's what this picture takes a look at here. The human impacts, humans have altered the carbon cycle. Usually the biggest one is the burning of the fossil fuels, where by burning fossil fuels that will release stored carbon into the atmosphere. This might cause an ecological disturbance, loss of many or all species in a community. Ecological legacies will be changed, and succession is the pattern of change after a disturbance that could be changed. Primary succession is when virtually all the resources are removed, and this process can take many, many years. A pattern of primary succession, when we remove everything, a pioneer species will come back and take the place of what was removed. And then a new species will also integrate itself into the community until we get to a climax community. And an example of that is shown in the icebergs and how they're melting. We have different species that will take their place. So with icebergs melting, we'll have what we call kind of a primary succession and then a secondary, and eventually we would get a climax species, which would fill up the area after the iceberg would completely melt away. So this kind of takes you through secondary succession and how it would happen over a period of time. And I'll let you guys look through these slides on your own. A cyclic succession is succession may increase chance of disturbance. An example of this really applicable right now are the fires. If you have a buildup of understory, this will lead to an extremely intense fire. And some ecosystems are naturally maintained by this cyclical succession. Pine cone seeds, the fire causes the pine cones to open up and release the seeds, so it actually allows them to spread their seeds. And this takes a look kind of at this cyclic succession of a forest and how fires are a natural part of the forest when they're not started illegally to get rid of some of the understory brush that has been built up. The importance of place and time, the surrounding areas also affect successional change. So if we have a bog or a bog that has water in it, that would affect the succession change of new species that could get integrated into it. Vermicomposting is using worms to break down food waste, and this was happened at a student tried to start a vermicomposting site at Michigan State University. There were some benefits and also some challenges on implementing that, but that is kind of our agent of change for this slideshow. Thanks for listening, guys. As always, please feel free to stop by my office hours on Sundays at 8 p.m. and I hope you guys are all doing well.